Hi there, my name's Charlie and I'm the Welfare Officer for MyAware. This video is to give you some advice about what to do if you receive a letter telling you that your old benefits will stop and that you will need to claim universal credit instead. So in this video I'm going to cover who can expect to get a letter telling them to claim universal credit, which is known as a migration notice, and when that letter is likely to arrive. What to do next if you do receive a migration notice, how to make sure you get compensation, which is known as transitional protection, if you'll be worse off on universal credit than you are on your current benefits, and some top tips on moving across to universal credit and what to bear in mind. So from April 2024 onwards, the DWP has been gradually writing to claimants of certain benefits and telling them that they need to claim universal credit instead. The benefits that are affected are called legacy benefits, and they are as follows: income support, income-based job seekers allowance or JSA, income-related employment and support allowance or ESA, housing benefit, although if you're a pensioner or if you're in supported or temporary accommodation, then your housing benefit might not be affected, and tax credits, so child tax credit and working tax credit. I should mention at this point that there are other types of JSA and ESA called contribution-based and new style JSA and ESA. If you're claiming either contribution-based or new style JSA or ESA, then you can stay on that benefit and you won't be expected to claim universal credit instead. If you're not sure what type of JSA or ESA you're claiming, it's probably a good idea to give DWP a ring to find out. I also briefly want to mention what happens if you're a pensioner. So universal credit is a benefit mainly for working age people. So if you're a pensioner and you're claiming housing benefit, you will be able to continue claiming housing benefit. These changes won't affect you. However, if you claim tax credits, you will be expected to claim pension credit instead, because tax credits are going to end for all claimants. If you're in a mixed age couple where one of you is over pension age and the other one is of working age, and you're on any of the benefits in this list, you will be expected to claim universal credit and your legacy benefits will end. How is universal credit different from the legacy benefits that you're used to? Well, universal credit is a means-tested benefit paid to people of working age, whether or not they work. So under the old system, you would have claimed a different benefit if you were, say, a carer, or if you were poorly, or if you were unemployed, or if you were working and on a low income. Under the universal credit system, you stay on universal credit regardless of your circumstances, as long as you're on a low-ish income and you don't have huge amounts of savings. Another difference for people who are in rented accommodation is that if you're used to getting housing benefit paid direct to your landlord, normally with universal credit you receive your rent money in your universal credit payment and you need to make arrangements to pay that to your landlord. Another difference is that whereas most other benefits are paid 2 weekly or 4 weekly, universal credit is paid monthly. It's also paid monthly in arrears, so a month behind, and the amount you receive will depend on what your income and your circumstances were over the previous month. Universal credit is also linked to the PAYE system, so as your earnings go up and down, so the PAYE system will be able to report to universal credit automatically on your earnings without you needing to contact DWP to tell them. People who can use computers are given an online universal credit account and are actually expected to claim online as well. And you're given an online journal which you will need to keep up to date and is your main means of communication with the DWP. So this is the timetable that the DWP is following in terms of migrating people onto universal credit. So between April 2024 and about August 2024, people who are claiming income support, tax credits and housing benefit can expect to receive their migration notices. And then from September 2024 onwards, people on income-based JSA and ESA can expect to start receiving their migration notices. This migration timetable has been sped up. Originally, people on JSA and ESA were not going to be moved onto universal credit for some time, perhaps not even until 2028-29, but the government is trying to hurry up the process to get everybody onto universal credit by the end of 2025. This is an example of a universal credit migration notice. You will see that it has a date on it that you must claim universal credit by. That's a deadline date and is really important to bear in mind. You might also get a general information leaflet about migration onto universal credit, but it's really important that you don't confuse that with a migration notice. The reason being that if you claim universal credit before you receive a migration notice and you find that you're actually worse off, you won't get any financial protection from being worse off. I will explain a bit more about that in a few minutes. If you've received a migration notice and you're sure it is a migration notice, then the important thing to pay attention to is the deadline, because this is the date by which you must claim universal credit. The date should be at least 3 months after you receive your migration notice, so you should have plenty of time to put in a claim. If you don't claim universal credit by the deadline, then your old benefits will end on the day before the deadline you've been given. If you do put in a claim for universal credit, then your old benefits will still end, but at least you'll have a universal credit claim in place to cover you financially. If you miss the deadline on your migration notice, you are actually given an extra month to claim, but obviously your old benefits will have stopped. If you claim by this final deadline a month later, your universal credit will be backdated to the original deadline date. If you miss the deadline and you miss the final deadline, then you can still put in a claim for universal credit, but the disadvantage is that you won't get any financial protection if you're worse off on universal credit than you were on your old benefits. To make a new claim for universal credit, you would normally go onto the gov.uk website and make a claim on there. But some people can't claim online, so if you have a disability that means that you can't claim online or you can't get online for whatever reason, you can make a telephone claim, and to do that you'd need to phone the Universal Credit helpline. If you need help claiming universal credit, you can contact an advisor through Citizens Advice's free Help to Claim phone service, which is available 8 AM till 6 PM Monday to Friday. If you're wondering whether you will be better off or worse off on universal credit, then the answer is that it really depends on your situation. Some people are better off, some people are worse off. In general terms, people who work tend to be better off on universal credit and people who are out of work tend to be worse off, but that is a generalisation. It really does depend on your circumstances. If you're not sure, I would suggest using an online benefit checker, so either Entitled To or Turn To Us, those are both excellent. Put in your current circumstances and your current benefits and see what that adds up to, and then take your legacy benefits out and see how much universal credit the system generates for you and see which is better and which is worse. If you're sure that you will be better off on universal credit, then you might as well claim straight away without waiting for a migration notice. However, I would bear in mind that universal credit might be paid less frequently than what you're used to, and there is a 5-week wait for your first payment. I've mentioned financial protection from being worse off on universal credit, so I'm going to explain a little bit about how that works. So DWP can't force you to move on to universal credit and leave you worse off than you were on your old legacy benefits. Therefore, if you claim universal credit after receiving a migration notice and you claim by the final deadline, and if what you used to get in your old benefits is more than you would get on universal credit, then the difference between those two figures is paid to you every month, and it's called a transitional element. I should mention at this point that the only time that you wouldn't get protection from being worse off on universal credit is if you didn't used to be affected by the benefit cap and you now are under universal credit. So if that happens to you, then I'm afraid there is no protection against that. If you are entitled to a transitional element, then over time it is likely to get smaller and will only protect you in the short term. And that's because it's the difference between the amount of old benefits you received at the time that you moved to universal credit and the amount of universal credit you're now entitled to, which is likely to increase over time. How to make sure you're protected from being worse off on universal credit. For most people, the most important thing to bear in mind if you think you are going to be worse off on universal credit is not to claim before you receive your migration notice, because if you jump ship early, you're not going to get that transitional protection. There is also a group of people who should be protected from being worse off on universal credit, regardless of whether they choose to move onto universal credit or whether they move when they receive a migration notice. And that's people who have severe disabilities, including children with disabilities. So if you receive a disability premium in your old benefits or an amount of money for a disabled child, there should be some protection for this when you migrate onto universal credit, whether or not you do so before the government asks you to claim. And if you don't get that money protected, and it may not be the full amount of disability money that you used to get, but you should get some. If you don't get that, it's worth challenging that via the mandatory reconsideration and appeals process. If you need any advice about asking for a mandatory reconsideration or appealing a decision, please get in touch with me because I've got lots of experience of helping with that. So in case you're feeling a bit confused, here's an example. So this is Mary. She claims income support and she receives a migration notice from the DWP, and that letter tells her that her income support is going to end and she must claim universal credit by the 1st of November 2024. So the 1st of November 2024 is her deadline date. Mary ignores the letter and her income support ends on the 31st of October, which is the day before her deadline day. She's then sent a reminder saying that her deadline for claiming universal credit has been extended to the 1st of December. So her income support has stopped, but she's got an extra window of time to claim universal credit. Mary does put in a universal credit claim before the final deadline of the 1st of December, and her universal credit is then backdated to the 1st of November. And her award includes a transitional element which protects her from being worse off. If she had missed her final deadline of the 1st of December, then she could still have claimed universal credit, but the element wouldn't have been included in her universal credit award. This next example is a bit of a warning of what can go wrong. So this is Naomi in Kingston, who received child tax credit for their 2 children. They just decide to claim universal credit early before they receive a migration notice telling them that they have to claim, and that's because they can see that the government is gradually writing to people, and they think, well, we might as well claim now. Unfortunately, after claiming universal credit, they realise that they're actually worse off now than they were on tax credits, but it's too late. They can't go back to tax credits. Once you've migrated to universal credit, you are stuck on universal credit. If they'd waited until they'd received a managed migration notice, they would have received a transitional element to protect them from being worse off. There are other kinds of protection that you get if you receive a migration notice and you claim by the deadline. And another type of protection is for people who are claiming tax credits who have a high rate of savings. And the situation here is that tax credits don't have a savings limit. So if you're claiming tax credits, your savings are not taken into account. However, on universal credit, savings are taken into account. So if you were on tax credits and you claim universal credit under the managed migration process, any savings you have over £16,000 will be ignored for 12 months as they would have been on tax credits. However, you are assumed to have income from any savings you have between £6,000 and £16,000, and that's an assumed income of £1 a week for every £250 you have over £6,000. So some top tips if you have received a migration notice. First of all, make sure that you claim by the final deadline to ensure that you get the transitional element to protect you from being worse off. If you know you're not going to be able to claim universal credit by your final deadline because somebody in the family's ill or in hospital or there's been some sort of emergency, you can ask the DWP to extend the deadline. However, they don't have to. It's discretionary. And if the DWP refuse to extend the deadline, then you can't appeal against that decision. However, you can ask them to extend the deadline as many times as you like, as long as you've got good cause for asking. Another tip, if you've received a migration notice, is to make sure that you're getting the right amount of your old benefits before you make a claim for universal credit. And that's because if you can maximise the amount of old benefits, then you're also going to be maximising the transitional element that you would get to protect you from being worse off on universal credit. So examples might be making sure that you're getting all of the right premiums on your old benefits, such as the severe disability premium perhaps, or a premium because you have a disabled child. If you're not sure how to check whether you're getting all of the premiums you should be on your legacy benefits, you can use an online benefit checker like the one on Turn to Us or Entitled To, or get in touch with me at MyAware and I can do a benefit check for you. If your migration notice arrives towards the end of the tax year, so around February or March time, it might be worth waiting until the start of the new tax year in April before moving across to universal credit. And that's because if you are receiving the transitional element, that is going to be made smaller at the start of every new tax year because that's when benefit rates go up. So as a general rule, it's probably better to migrate at the start of the tax year rather than at the end of the tax year. Last tip is that any changes that take place during your first month after you've put in that claim for universal credit won't affect your transitional element. So if you know you've got changes coming that are going to increase the amount of universal credit you're entitled to, for example, maybe you've got a child joining your household, or maybe you're about to change your hours of work, it's probably a good idea to try to time them, if you've got any control over the timing, to take place during your first month on universal credit or before, so that they don't begin to erode your transitional element. So having said that, do ensure that you claim before your final deadline. You might be wondering whether there'll be a gap between your old benefits ending and your universal credit starting if you do claim by the deadline. And the answer to that is yes, because it normally takes universal credit 5 weeks to start paying. So you need to be prepared to cover that gap. If you were a tax credit claimant, then tax credits will stop immediately as soon as you claim universal credit. Housing benefit, income support, job seekers allowance and ESA will stop 2 weeks after you claim universal credit, so that gap will only become 3 weeks rather than 5. If you're going to struggle to bridge that gap, you can ask for a budgeting advance from universal credit, but it is a loan. What they do is they deduct that from the amount of universal credit you would get in a typical month, and then they will gradually deduct that from the subsequent universal credit payments that you receive. I do hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions about migrating onto universal credit, please email me at welfare@myaware.org, or get in touch if you've got any other welfare benefits or other welfare rights questions. Thanks very much.